I was in disbelief. I had just arrived at the restaurant with my two sons, the oldest pushing open the glass door with that energy only teenagers have, and the youngest still wearing his soccer jersey, sweaty but happy, when I spotted my wife sitting at a table in the back. She was laughing. Laughing with a man. A man I had seen before, and not as a friend. It was her boss. The same guy she swore weeks ago that she barely spoke to outside of work. There was a glass of wine in front of her, another in front of him. The two of them leaned toward each other, as if they were in a parallel world where our family's existence was nothing more than an inconvenient detail. While my sons chose a table in the corner, with a view of the TV, I approached their table in silence, and when she saw me, her smile faded. She didn't say anything. She didn't move her lips. She just froze. The man across the table cleared his throat uncomfortably, trying to appear dignified as he adjusted his napkin on his lap. And I looked her straight in the eyes, my heart trying to beat out of my mouth, and I said, with a calmness that seemed more like desperation, "Our children are at the other table and they have no idea. I'm leaving with them right now. I hope you don't look for us anymore." And I went. I left with the dignity I still had left and with two children who had no idea that they had just lost their mother in an irreversible way. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and the image of her laughing still stuck in my mind like a stain that no amount of effort could remove. Did they talk? Did they touch each other? How many times had that happened before? How had I not noticed? It had been weeks, maybe months. There hadn't been such clear signs, but now everything made sense, the cell phone turned upside down, the perfume she had started wearing for no apparent reason, the last-minute cancelled dinners, the backlog of work from the weekend. And here I was, like an idiot, thinking that the problem was stress. That she was just overwhelmed, tired, lost. I embraced her emptiness as if it were my own. The children fell asleep quickly that night. I didn't. I sat in the living room with the lights off and stayed there, in the dark, staring at the reflection in the window. Thinking about everything I had built. Thinking about how a story of years, with plans, memories, children, promises and silent pacts, could be put at risk by a simple sequence of selfish decisions. Because in the end, that was it, selfishness. A choice. A decision. To cheat, lie and hide. And she did all of this coldly. She gave me cold looks while smiling warmly at another man. I wondered if she thought about me when she was with him. If at some point during the day, between coffee and texting, she remembered the bedtime stories we told the boys together, the Sunday mornings with pancakes and loud music. Did she remember? Or had she already replaced everything with a new plot where I was just the character who needed to leave the scene for the new story to blossom? In the following days, she tried to contact me. She started with short messages, then phone calls. She sent me crying audio messages, saying it was a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she was confused. Confused. As if confusion justified betrayal. She showed up at my door on a Tuesday at 7 in the evening, saying she just wanted to talk. I looked at her from the other side of the gate and told her there was nothing more to say. That her silence that night spoke louder than any justification now. She tried to get closer to the boys, but they shut her out. The oldest started calling her by her first name. The youngest drew the house with just 3 dolls. Our weekends returned to silence in the places where there used to be laughter. But, little by little, we began to adjust. To the pain, to the absence, to the reconfiguration of our lives. And then the unexpected happened. One day, months later, I was invited to a get-together at my son's school. I went without any expectations, like someone who was just following a formality. And then, among the plastic chairs and the shy smiles of the parents, I saw her. A woman, alone, with a smile that was not forced. The smile of someone who knew what she wanted. And our eyes met. She didn't know my story, and I didn't know hers, but there was something in the way she looked at me that disarmed me. We talked that night. And within a few weeks, we were sharing coffees and confiding in each other. The boys adored her. She listened to them. She looked them in the eyes. And, above all, she respected the silences that still remained within us. She never wanted to replace anyone. She simply filled the space that had been emptied, with care, with time, with truth. It was then that she, the woman who betrayed me, reappeared. But this time, in a calculated, rehearsed way, as if she had finally realized what she had lost. She arranged a meeting, asked to talk. She said she had deeply regretted it. That she thought about us every day. That she wanted to get our family back. That the months away had made her see how wrong she had been, and that if she could go back, she would never have risked everything. I took a deep breath. We were in a discreet cafe, near the park where we used to take the boys. And when she asked for another chance, I smiled. But not mockingly. It was a sad, sincere smile, of someone who no longer belonged to the pain that had once been unbearable. And then, before I could say anything, she looked back, as if she sensed something strange. And he saw. She saw the woman who was with me. The woman who arrived a few minutes later and kissed me on the cheek naturally. The woman who held my hand, sat down next to me and asked how the youngest was doing at school. She froze. Just like that night at the restaurant. She was speechless. Her eyes filled with tears. And only there, faced with the new scene, the new setting, did she understand. That the time it took her to regret was the same time it took me to move on. That while she was rehearsing words of regret, I was learning to live again. That the space she had abandoned was no longer vacant. And that's when everything changes. Because the real turning point wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't the abandonment. It was the moment when the one who was left behind became the one chosen by someone who saw value where the other only saw routine. But, what if I told you that this story still has one last surprise? Something that she discovered shortly after, and that turned her regret into something even more bitter. Something she never expected. Something that is yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, on the contrary, our stories show how it destroys lives, families and hearts. All the stories you hear are fictional, created to reflect the real pain of those who have been betrayed and the consequences of selfish choices. Now get ready, because what comes next is a shocking story, full of twists, emotions and painful truths. Press play, and take a deep breath. In the leafy neighborhood where the houses had spacious porches, well-kept gardens and neighbors who exchanged smiles on Sunday mornings, lived a couple who, in the eyes of everyone, represented the picture of stability and complicity. Daniel and Laura had been married for 12 years. They built their story amidst comforting silences and looks that said more than any declaration. They had 2 children, Thomas, 9 years old, curious and sensitive, and Leo, 14, in the middle of the transition between childhood and adolescence, carrying in his chest the typical intensity of someone who begins to realize that the adult world is much more complex than he imagined. The family's life revolved around well-defined routines, breakfast together whenever possible, weekend lunches filled with spontaneous laughter, and moments when the house seemed like a refuge isolated from the world, where time passed gently. Daniel was a man of simple habits, with a natural kindness that required no effort. He worked in financial consulting, and although his profession involved numbers, his soul was made of caring. He was the kind of man who remembered wedding anniversaries weeks in advance, who bought flowers not out of obligation, but because he saw in them a reflection of the delicacy he saw in his wife. For Laura, he was always her safe haven. Intelligent, present, an attentive father and a calm husband, the kind who knew when to talk and, above all, when to listen. Even on days when he was extremely tired, Daniel made a point of sitting on the living room couch to listen to his children tell him about their day's adventures, as if that was what really mattered to him. And it was. Laura, on the other hand, had a restless spirit. A graduate in communications, she had always been fascinated by the power of words. After her boys were old enough to spend the day at school, she decided to return to the job market. She got a job as a marketing assistant at a rapidly growing technology company. She started dressing more carefully again, as she had done before becoming a full-time mother. She rediscovered the pleasure of wearing heels, discreet makeup, and attending meetings where her opinion was heard and respected. Laura was an intelligent woman, with a strong gaze and engaging speech, someone who drew attention for her balance between elegance and authenticity. She loved her children intensely, and even on the most exhausting nights, she made a point of sitting next to them to review their homework or just talk before bed. Their marriage seemed solid, but like any long-term relationship, there were moments of disagreement. Not fights, but small disconnections, like when she talked about her new project at work and he, tired, just nodded without really paying attention. Or when he tried to tell her about an achievement at the office and she got distracted by the notifications on her phone. Subtle things, but over time they created small, imperceptible cracks, the kind you don't notice until they get too big. Still, there was respect, admiration, and a shared history. The photos on the walls of the house spoke of travels, of birthdays celebrated with simplicity, of a life built with effort, yes, but also with affection. The children were the center of their universe. Thomas had a habit of sleeping with his mother's teddy bear as a gift to him when he was 4, and Leo, although he was entering the phase where he wanted to appear independent, still sought out his father for advice about school, soccer, and the insecurities that were beginning to emerge. Daniel loved taking the boys out for bike rides on the weekends, while Laura baked cakes and invited the neighborhood kids to play in the backyard. Their house was full of movement and life. The children's friends came and went, the television was almost never turned off, and there was always the smell of home-cooked food in the air. It was a home that vibrated. Daniel was not a man with many friends. He preferred the company of his family. His leisure time consisted of reading history books, watching documentaries and, occasionally, getting together with 2 college friends to talk about politics and football. Laura, on the other hand, had a more active social circle. She enjoyed conversations, events, and being around people. And it was precisely in the workplace that she began to feel alive in a way she had not felt for a long time. Receiving praise for her competence, seeing her ideas being implemented, being called to strategic meetings, all of this gave her a new kind of energy, a sense of purpose that, although genuine, also took her away, albeit slowly, from the family routine. But that didn't mean, in her mind, that she was falling out of love. Laura loved Daniel. She was just rediscovering parts of herself that had been dormant between diapers, sleepless nights, and her absolute dedication to her children. Sometimes she wondered if she was still the same woman she was when they got married. She looked at herself in the mirror carefully, trying to find the traces of her youth, her curves, her dreams. And sometimes she felt frustrated. Not because of Daniel, but because life, as she herself said, isn't just about love. It's about time. And time changes everything. During dinners, Daniel still pulled out her chair for her. He served her favorite wine on Friday nights, and made sure to wash the dishes when he noticed she was tired. These were simple but consistent gestures. Laura smiled. She thanked him. But at certain moments, she felt that something had changed between them, or maybe inside her. A kind of longing for herself. That woman full of desires, wishes, and plans that didn't just include being a mother and wife. She didn't want to give up her family life, but she longed for something she couldn't even name. And in the process, she began to withdraw emotionally, without realizing it. Daniel, although he realized that something was not the same, did not have the tools to understand what it was. He thought it was just a phase, like so many others he had experienced. He attributed it to her new job, to the tiredness of her daily routine, to the weight of her responsibilities. He never suspected anything serious. He continued to do his part, taking care of the children, sharing the household chores, buying flowers on their anniversary and taking her car to the mechanic without her asking. He was a man who believed in love as a daily construction, and not as something that can be maintained on its own. The relationship was walking through these warm waters, where everything seemed calm, but where silent currents were slowly pulling you to the bottom. Laura smiled, but her eyes were sometimes distant. Daniel spoke, but was not always heard. And even with these disagreements, there was affection. There were still kisses on the forehead before bed, affectionate messages during the day, long hugs on their children's birthdays. But the silence between them said more than the gestures. At school, the boys continued to do well. They participated in competitions, made new friends, and brought back notes from the teacher praising their behavior. Laura was proud of them, and Daniel was thrilled with each small improvement. The house was in order, the routine flowed smoothly, and commitments were kept. But the connection between the two, that invisible thread that unites a real couple, seemed increasingly stretched. It hadn't broken yet. But it was shaking. It was at this point in the story that a series of decisions, small, silent, almost imperceptible, began to shape what was to come. Decisions that would completely change the course of that family's life. Decisions that, at that moment, were not yet seen as dangerous. Because no one cheats overnight. It all begins silently, like a seed planted in the soil of dissatisfaction. First, an untimely conversation. Then, a prolonged exchange of glances. A compliment that makes the heart beat a little faster. A smile that provokes a pleasant discomfort. A thought that returns at the end of the day. And thus the distance is born. But at that time, no one knew anything. Not Daniel, not the boys, not the co-workers. Everyone just watched a seemingly happy family, with dinners on the table, laughter in the hallways and smiling portraits in the frames on the bookshelf. No one imagined that behind that perfect home, something invisible and powerful had already begun to grow. And what no one knew, yet, was how destructive that growth would be. But before the destruction, there was love. There was the intention to stay. There were, in fact, two adults trying to get it right, even with their flaws, even with the weariness. And that's what makes this story even more painful, the fact that no one goes into a marriage planning to fail. And yet, some do fail. Laura started leaving home earlier. She did it subtly, not to arouse suspicion. Sometimes she would say she had a meeting with the new marketing manager, other times she would just mention that she needed to review a presentation before work. Daniel didn't question her. He had never been the controlling type. He trusted her with the naturalness of someone who had built a 12-year relationship based on small gestures. She, in turn, kept her voice light when she left, kissed her children sweetly and gave him a smile that now seemed more polite than spontaneous. Laura stood out at the company. Her ideas began to circulate among the directors, her ease in meetings became noticeable and, as a result, she was invited to join increasingly strategic projects. Her direct boss, Kaio, a man with an elegant appearance and a calm voice, soon became a frequent presence in her daily interactions. He was discreet, but there was an intensity in his compliments, an attention to detail, a way of looking at things that reminded Laura of a time when she felt desired. In the hallways, the relationship between the two did not go beyond professional boundaries. But there were signs. Signs that only those who have experienced something similar can recognize. An exchange of glances that lasted a second longer, a smile at the corner of the mouth, a light touch when turning a page, and silences that said much more than words. Laura, torn between emotion and fear, began to carry a kind of anticipated guilt, even though she had not done anything yet. But this nothing was already too much. Because thinking was already, in a way, starting to build. She began to pay more attention to herself, to the clothes she wore, her perfume, her hair. At home, the conversations with Daniel continued, but something inside her was no longer present. Hugs became mechanical, kisses became rare, and touch became absent. Daniel noticed the distance, but preferred to believe that it was just a phase. He was practical. Realistic. He attributed everything to her work, to tiredness. Routine has these things. The mind sometimes prefers to ignore it than to face it. Laura, even though she was aware of the slippery terrain she was treading on, allowed herself to take small detours. She started having lunch with Kaio more often. First with the whole team, then in pairs, until they started having lunch alone, in more discreet places. They talked about life, about old dreams, frustrations, and unfulfilled desires. Kaio listened attentively, asked the right questions, and laughed at just the right moment. He made her feel alive. And that, for her, was addictive. It wasn't just attraction. It was the feeling of being seen. Of being desired in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. She still loved her family and her children, but she began to mentally separate what it meant to be a mother, what it meant to be a wife, and what it meant to be a woman. Kaio reminded her of herself, or at least of the image she wanted to have of herself. One day, after a more tense meeting, he invited her to decompress at a cafe outside the company. They laughed together, talked about everything, and when they said goodbye, he looked at her intensely, as if he didn't need to say anything. Laura felt a shiver run through her entire body. She went home that night with her mind elsewhere, avoiding Daniel's gaze and answering her children's questions with short sentences. Weeks passed and the line between the emotional and the physical began to blur. Messages arrived after hours, unexpected compliments, a touch on the arm that lasted longer than it should have, an invitation to a work trip that, according to him, would be important for her growth in the company. And she accepted. She told Daniel that it was an opportunity. He, as always, supported her. He packed her bags for her, left a loving note among her clothes, took her children to the movies on the weekend to distract them from their mother's absence. Laura traveled with a broken heart. But, deep down, she already knew what she was about to do. And she did it. On the evening of the second day of the trip, they had dinner together after the event. The restaurant was elegant, dimly lit, with a low, enveloping soundtrack. The wine arrived before the food. Conversations were almost whispers. When Kaio held her hand across the table, Laura didn't back away. She looked into his eyes and realized that she had already crossed the line before he even touched her. They went to the hotel and entered the room without words, as if everything had been rehearsed. The silence became complicit. She surrendered herself with intensity, as if she needed to prove to herself that she was still desirable, that she still had power over her own body and over other people's desires. She didn't think about Daniel, her children, or anything other than the moment. When she returned to her room after that, she cried alone in the bathroom. She looked at her own reflection and felt ashamed. But not enough to stop what would come next. Back to her routine, Laura tried to act normally. She tried to keep the same gestures at home, the same words, the same rituals. But nothing was the same. The guilt was real now. And it came in waves. During breakfast, when Daniel smiled without knowing anything. When she heard the boys telling stories about school. When she saw his clothes mixed with hers in the closet. Everything in her screamed that something was wrong. But she didn't stop. She kept seeing Kaio. In discreet encounters, disguised as meetings or happy hours. The risk became part of the excitement. At home, Daniel began to notice that Laura avoided touching him. Sex became rare. When it happened, it was cold. He tried to talk, but she always said she was tired. He insisted on a few dinners, attempts to reconnect, but she treated them as obligations. The children began to notice the tension. Leo began to question his mother with looks, and Thomas, more sensitive, asked to sleep in his parents' room more often. The break came on a normal night. Daniel decided to take his children out to dinner after soccer practice. They were excited, laughing in the car, and he decided to stop at a restaurant they usually went to for birthdays. When he entered, his eyes scanned the room until he found the image that would tear his world in two. Laura was there. Sitting across from Kaio. Smiling. Her hand on his. Her eyes locked on his. As if nothing existed around them. Time stood still. Daniel walked over to the table without thinking. When she saw him, she froze. Her smile died. Kaio stepped back, as if he realized too late that he had crossed a line. Daniel simply said, "Our children are at the other table and they have no idea. I'm leaving with them right now. I hope you don't look for us anymore." Laura sat there in shock. She didn't try to stop him, she didn't say anything. She just watched the man she had built a life with turn his back, without shouting, without humiliating him. A silence that screamed louder than any scene. In that moment, she knew she had lost more than she could bear. What she didn't know, yet, was that that moment would only be the beginning. And that the real weight of what she had done was not only in what she had destroyed, but in what she would never be able to rebuild. Because while she was trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together, something even more devastating was about to happen. Daniel didn't respond to any of the messages. Neither the voice messages nor the text messages. He also didn't answer any of the calls. When Laura knocked on the door 2 days later, he simply didn't open the door. She stood there, motionless, for long minutes, listening to her children's hurried footsteps inside the house, feeling the silence of someone who no longer wanted to hear explanations. The lack of reaction hurt more than a scream. In the following days, she tried to contact the boys' school, called a mutual friend, even her mother-in-law, but no one gave her any information. The only thing she knew was that Daniel had taken leave from work, taken the children out of school temporarily, and distanced himself from social media. It was as if he had erased all traces of the life they had once shared. Laura found herself, for the first time in years, completely alone. And it was in this void that regret began to corrode not only her conscience, but her identity. Returning to work was like entering a poisoned environment. The atmosphere with Kaio had changed. There was no more flirting, no sparkle in their eyes. Just brief glances and mechanical conversations. What had once seemed like a seductive game was now an uncomfortable presence. They began to avoid meetings together, to pass each other in the hallways without exchanging a word. No one there knew what had happened, but the two of them distanced themselves from each other like strangers carrying a cursed pact between their eyes. Laura began to arrive earlier and leave later, trying to fill in with tasks the silence and guilt screamed endlessly in her head. On the weekends, she would stay locked up at home, scouring social media for any clue about her children, trying to find out if Daniel had rebuilt his life, if they still lived in the same house, if he spoke about her with anyone. But there was nothing. The lack of answers was the cruelest presence that could exist. Until one cloudy Friday afternoon, after weeks of absolute silence, she received a message. It was short, emotionless, with only the date, time, and the name of a restaurant. It was from Daniel. There was no question, no greeting. It was as if he were summoning her, not inviting her. Laura hesitated. She didn't know if she should go. But part of her needed that conversation, even if it was to hear what she didn't want to hear. She arrived before the scheduled time, chose a table in the corner, and watched the couples around her, all in their own worlds, smiling, exchanging glances. She felt envious of every simple gesture. When Daniel arrived, he was different. Thinner, with a marked face, a hard look in his eyes. But there was a firm, almost cold calm in his movements. He sat down without even looking directly at her. Laura said his name, but he didn't answer. He just asked for a coffee. When he finally looked at her, there was something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. Like someone who no longer needed any explanation. Laura tried to start, saying that she wanted to ask for forgiveness, that she knew she had made a mistake, that there was no justification, that it had all been an impulse, a mistake that she would give anything to erase. He interrupted her calmly but firmly. He said that he wasn't there to hear excuses, that he didn't want justifications. He was there to make it clear that there was nothing between them anymore, no possibility, no reconstruction, no attempts. And that she needed to accept that. Laura begged. She said that she missed her home, her children, her routine, him. She said that Kaio meant nothing, that everything had been a misinterpreted void, a cry for attention. Daniel remained silent. Only after she repeated that she would do anything, anything at all, to try to make amends, did he take a deep breath and say that she should be prepared for what was coming, because there was something she still didn't know. Laura didn't understand. She thought he was referring to a divorce case, or perhaps child custody. But Daniel looked at her with firm eyes and told her something that made her freeze completely. That week, a few days after the dinner where she was caught with her boss, Daniel, encouraged by a close friend, decided to return to an old, dormant passion, photography. He attended a meeting of photographers in a small, almost hidden gallery, and there, at the end of the event, he met a woman named Isabel. She was a widow, mother of a girl, had a discreet smile and a calm voice that contrasted with the intensity of her gaze. They spoke for a short time that night, but there was a strange, almost silent connection. They exchanged contact details and began to chat casually. Laura listened to everything in silence, not knowing where it was going. Daniel continued. He said that in the following days, Isabel became a constant companion. First as a friend, then as a presence. She met the children without pretense. Thomas adored her immediately, and Leo, although reluctant, began to respect her. She never tried to take up space, but built affection with kindness. She was discreet, patient, and non-judgmental. She simply offered shelter. And one day, when they returned from an outing, Thomas called her "beautiful aunt" in the back seat of the car, and Daniel felt that this said more than any statement. He told Laura this without raising his voice, without irony. He said that he never imagined loving someone after everything. But that he had found peace. And that, for the first time in months, his children laughed out loud again. Laura held back her tears, trying to absorb the information. He looked her in the eyes and asked if she thought it was fair that, after everything, he still had to be alone. That he should be punished for a choice that was not his. He said that the betrayal was not only against him, but against his children. And that, no matter how much she regretted it, regret does not rebuild trust. Laura tried to argue. She said that she did not expect him to be alone, that she understood, but that it was still early, that the children were hers too. Daniel then handed her a letter. It was from Leo. Handwritten. A short, direct, but devastating text. In it, the boy said that he had decided not to see his mother for a while. That he needed to understand what I felt. That he was tired of seeing his father sad. And that Isabel helped him laugh again. Laura could not hold back her tears. Daniel just stood up, looked at her one last time and told her that she needed to stop thinking about what she lost and start thinking about what she caused. And he left. Laura sat alone at the table, with the cold coffee in front of her, Leo's letter in her hands, and her heart crushed between what she wanted and what she no longer had. She tried to breathe, but it seemed like everything around her had emptied out. She got up aimlessly. She went back home and spent the night reading the letter over and over again. Each line was like a slow stab. In the morning, she got in the car and, without warning, went to the old house. She stopped on the other side of the street and waited. She wanted to see her children, to see Daniel. And then she saw something that broke her completely. The door opened. Thomas came out first, laughing. Right behind him, Leo, with his backpack on his back. And last, Isabel. She was carrying a lunchbox and was arranging the youngest's coat with the same care that Laura did. Daniel came out next, laughing, holding the keys. He kissed Isabel on the cheek. The boys smiled. And they got into the car. There was no more room for her there. She realized, at that moment, that she was not just a regretful woman. She was a woman who had been replaced. And what had once been longing, was now absence. Definitive. Laura stayed inside the car, motionless. She knew she couldn't get out. She knew that if she called the boys, they might turn away. And if she called Daniel, he would just keep going. She stayed there for long minutes, while their car disappeared into the distance. And it was at that moment that she understood the real weight of the loss. It wasn't the house, nor the marriage. It was the fact that, even though she still loved, she was no longer loved. And that can't be fixed with regret. In the days that followed, Laura fell into a dark silence. He no longer tried to explain himself, nor did he defend himself. The feeling of loss was as physical as it was emotional, as if a part of his body had been ripped away and the space left behind could no longer be filled by anything. He stopped going to work. Not out of shame, but because being in that environment meant facing head-on the memory of everything that had triggered the ruin. He resigned with a dry email, without justification. He did not return to say goodbye to anyone. He spent his days at home, looking at the walls, looking at old photos that he had not yet had the courage to delete, listening to audios from his children from months before. That time when life seemed to have direction. The time that she, with her own hands, let slip away. No word seemed enough now, no gesture seemed capable of reversing the situation. What tore her apart the most, however, was not regret. It was the knowledge that forgiveness, even if possible, would not give back what was gone. She moved to a small, hastily rented apartment far from her old neighborhood. She needed to start over, although she didn't even know where to start. Her attempts to re-establish some contact with her children were met with indifference. Thomas, when he answered, limited himself to short, monosyllabic answers. Leo, more resistant, began to ignore her completely. Their separation was a punishment that no prison could inflict. More than once she wrote long messages and deleted them before sending them. She didn't want to beg, but she also couldn't simply disappear. One afternoon, when she went out to buy bread, she saw an old friend from the neighborhood in the distance. She tried to smile and wave. The woman stared at her for a few seconds, as if she recognized her, but didn't respond. And then she turned her face away and walked on. Laura understood, then and there, that her name was now accompanied by a story that no one wanted to hear anymore. She had become a figure surrounded by silence and judgment. Months passed. The seasons changed, and with them, Daniel's life itself. He returned to work, now in a different area, with flexible hours so he could be more present with his children. He began to take professional photographs. He took courses, expanded his portfolio, and began to photograph weddings, baptisms, and happy moments for other families, an irony that he himself recognized but learned to respect. Isabel was still present, but not intrusive. She knew her place and did not force doors. The boys became attached to her organically. Not as a replacement, but as a welcome. At home, there was music again. There were routines that worked. And, most importantly, there was peace. It was on a Saturday morning that Laura, driven by a need she couldn't name, decided to go to the old house for the first time since everything. Not to knock on the door, but to see it from afar. I needed to understand if it still hurt the same way. He parked the car a block away and walked to the corner. From there, I could see the garage, the familiar facade, now with new curtains. Different flowers in the garden, a bicycle leaning against the wall. Everything was the same, but completely different. As I watched, a car approached and stopped at the entrance. It was Daniel. He got out smiling, with a bakery bag in one hand and his cell phone in the other. Isabel came out next, wearing a loose blouse and her hair tied up. Thomas ran towards her with a drawing in his hand, and Leo appeared soon after, carrying a guitar. The scene lasted a few seconds, but it was enough. Laura felt something sink inside her chest. It wasn't anger, nor pain. It was a kind of bitter surrender. It didn't belong to her anymore. She walked home slowly, as if carrying a farewell on her shoulders. She slept little that night. The next morning, she woke up determined. She wrote a letter. Not to Daniel, nor to her children. She wrote to herself. She described everything. The love she felt, the mistakes she had made, the moment she realized that the void she sought to fill was not outside, but inside. She told how Caio had become irrelevant, how fleeting pleasure gave way to eternal regret. She wrote as someone who no longer expected redemption, but who needed to record that she had learned. And at the end of the letter, she simply asked that one day, if her children wanted, they read her words. Not to forgive her, but to understand that even those who make terrible mistakes can be able to understand the depth of what they have lost. A few weeks later, Laura received an unexpected message. It wasn't from Daniel or the children. It was from Isabel. Short and direct. She asked to meet her at a discreet cafe in the city center. Her heart raced. She didn't know what to expect. She thought about refusing, but something in her told her she had to go. She arrived early, nervous, with sweaty hands. Isabel arrived punctually. She was wearing simple clothes, no makeup, and had a look that mixed firmness and empathy. She sat down without ceremony, ordered a tea, and began to speak bluntly. He said he wasn't there for confrontations or speeches. She said she loved the boys and did her best to be good to them. But that, no matter how many mistakes Laura had made, she was still their mother. And that, sooner or later, that would weigh on their hearts. Laura tried to thank him, but her voice faltered. Isabel continued. She said that it was not her intention to take anyone's place, but that affections cannot be controlled. She said that Daniel did not seek her out for revenge, but out of necessity. That he was hurt, yes, but that he would never use his children as a shield. Laura cried softly. Isabel waited. And then, as if giving a fragile gift, she said that she thought it might be time for a conversation. Not between her and Daniel, but with her children. A brief meeting, without expectations. Just so they could look into each other's eyes. Laura nodded. Without words. Just a nod and a suppressed sob. The following Saturday, she met the boys in a park. Thomas was the first to run up to her. Leo came later, slower, his eyes full of questions. They talked for hours. They spoke little at first, but little by little, the silences were filled with memories. Laura asked for forgiveness. She didn't promise anything. She didn't ask for anything. She just told them what she needed to tell them. How much she thought about them, how much she missed them, how much she understood their pain. Leo listened to her attentively. Thomas, with a softer look in his eyes, held her hand at one point. At the end of the meeting, Leo said he didn't know when he would be ready for a real rapprochement. But that this meeting was already a step. The following week, Laura went to the therapist. For the first time. She began a process of internal reconstruction. Not to win anyone back, but to understand herself. On the other side of the city, life was moving at a different pace. Daniel and Isabel organized a short trip with the boys. Nothing grand, just a weekend in a rented house, with a bonfire, guitar and peace. At night, sitting together on the porch, Daniel held Isabel's hand and said that if she ever wanted to make it official, he would be ready. She smiled, without answering. She just rested her head on his shoulder. And that's how everything changed. Betrayal didn't just destroy a marriage. It exposed the fragility of choices, the importance of silence, the weight of absences. But it also revealed the strength that exists in starting over, the possibility of rebuilding even on ruins. Not all homes are forever. Not all mistakes are forgivable. But there is still beauty in moving forward. Even when the heart bears scars that will never fade. That encounter in the park left deep scars on both Laura and her children. Even though there were no big smiles or tight hugs, there was an invisible thread of connection being slowly sewn, stitch by stitch, between what had once been broken and what now needed time to be understood. Leo, although more reserved, began to respond to messages with a little more attention, and Thomas, with the innocence of someone who still believes in redemption, was more receptive. Laura didn't expect miracles. She no longer made illusory plans. But there was something true in simply being able to look into her children's eyes and be seen, even if for a few seconds. The hardest part, however, was still dealing with living from a distance. Knowing that the moments that once belonged to her were now being lived with another woman. Someone who didn't steal, but who occupied a space left by her own choices. This awareness, although painful, also brought a strange kind of relief. Because it was no longer about competition. It was about understanding that some losses are definitive. Daniel, on the other hand, was going through a new phase. Isabel was always by his side, but without pressure. They had built a relationship based on maturity and mutual respect. There were no exaggerated demands or empty promises. Their life together was made up of gentle routines, lazy lunches on Sundays, deep conversations at the end of the day. The boys were adapting well, but there were still sensitive issues. Leo, although more reserved, was beginning to accept Isabel in a more genuine way. Not as a mother, because that place was not open. But as someone who, even without obligation, chose to be there. Thomas, more dedicated, already made a point of having her close by for schoolwork, games, and cartoons. Daniel observed everything cautiously, afraid of overstepping the limits he had imposed as a form of emotional protection. One rainy afternoon, Isabel found a letter in the closet. It was from Laura, addressed to her. A white envelope, with shaky handwriting and the faint scent of a familiar perfume. On the paper, Laura didn't ask for anything. She just said thank you. She said that, as contradictory as it was comforting to know that her children were being cared for by someone who truly loved them. She acknowledged her absence, without playing the victim. She acknowledged her mistakes, without trying to water them down. And, most of all, she made it clear that she didn't want to recover what she had lost, but to ensure that what still existed, her love for her children, was not contaminated by the pain. Isabel read it all in silence. She folded the letter carefully and put it back, as if she were receiving something sacred. She didn't show it to Daniel. Not because it was a secret, but because she knew that this gesture was only hers. Laura resumed her sessions with the therapist. He talked about everything, the years of marriage, the mistake, the pain, the shame, the loneliness. But also about the small steps taken since then. The new routine, the freelance work, the books she had started reading again, the places where, alone, she rediscovered herself. The psychologist encouraged her to let go of self-punishment. Not to forget, but to rebuild. There were days when Laura thought about leaving the city. About trying to start over far away, where no one knew her, where she could breathe without the weight of their gazes. But whenever she thought about her children, something pulled her back. She couldn't disappear. I needed, even from a distance, to be available for the day they wanted to come back, even if it was just to tell them what still hurt. And that day came sooner than she imagined. One Saturday afternoon, she received a message from Leo. A short one. He said he wanted to talk. Alone. They met at a simple cafe, with tables on the sidewalk and few people around. When he arrived, Laura could barely recognize the boy she had raised. He was taller, more serious, more mature. They sat in silence for a few minutes. He didn't look away from her, but he didn't smile either. He said he still felt angry. That there were nights when he couldn't sleep when he remembered the scene in the restaurant. That he didn't understand how someone he claimed to love so much could do what he did. But he also said that, somehow, he wanted to understand. Laura took a deep breath and told him what she had felt at the time, how she felt lost between roles and expectations, how she hadn't known how to ask for help. She said there was no excuse, only regret. She didn't cry. She spoke firmly, but also with pain. Leo listened to everything in silence. When they finished their coffee, he said he didn't promise anything. But that maybe he would talk to her more often again. He left without a hug, but with a less cold look. That conversation marked a turning point. Not a reconciliation, but a possibility. Laura went home with a heavy chest and a strange heart. She didn't know if that was a beginning or an end. She only knew that she had to keep going. A few weeks later, Thomas invited her to watch the school's theater performance. Daniel would also be there, with Isabel. She almost refused, but her son insisted. She sat in the back rows, so as not to make anyone uncomfortable. When the boys entered the stage, the youngest looked for her eyes in the audience and smiled. Daniel noticed. He didn't say anything. He just lowered his eyes and took a deep breath. At the end of the performance, Laura approached him. She thanked him discreetly. Isabel returned a restrained nod. Daniel was cordial. Thomas hugged her without fear. Leo said, "See you later." And for the first time in a long time, Laura left feeling that, perhaps, the weight she was carrying was no longer so unbearable. The dilemma that remained was invisible, but present. How can one continue living with the certainty that forgiveness does not mean return? How can one accept that certain scars, even if they no longer hurt, are still there, exposed? Laura learned, over time, that it is not about forgetting, but about respecting the impact of one's own decisions. She began working with women who were going through similar processes, helping others deal with the echoes of guilt, with the consequences of silence. He found purpose where before there was only ruin. On the other side, Daniel remained firm. But not immune. There were nights when he wondered if he could have done something differently, if he could have seen it sooner, avoided it, protected it more. But when he looked at his children sleeping, and Isabel by his side, he understood that what was done could not be undone. And that the present, even if born of pain, was real. The children gradually learned to deal with the duality of affection. They didn't have to choose sides, but they weren't forced to forget either. Laura started seeing them more often. Not every day, not fully, but consistently. Little by little, they rebuilt small rituals. A walk, a dessert, a chat in the square. Daniel watched from a distance. He didn't interfere. He didn't encourage, but he didn't block either. He understood that it was their process, between mother and children. And he respected each one's time. Time, in fact, became the only true measure of that story. It did not erase, but it adjusted. It did not heal completely, but it taught. And it was with this lesson that everyone continued. In different directions, with paths that would never cross in the same way. But with the certainty that, even what shatters, can one day stop cutting. Even if it remains broken. And yet, there is life. Laura began to rediscover her own voice in places she had never paid attention to before. Life, even with its harsh silences, began to organize the internal spaces that had previously been filled with guilt. The reunion with her children at the theater was a milestone, but not the end. It was as if with each encounter, even the briefest, she gained a few more seconds of belonging. She began to respect their time, without pressuring them, without creating unrealistic expectations. Little by little, she learned to listen without responding immediately, to accept silences as part of the process, and not as rejection. Leo still maintained a certain emotional distance, but there were already exchanges. Short messages, sometimes a call to ask something trivial. That was all Laura needed to keep going. Thomas, on the other hand, was more generous. He began to tell her details about school, ask for advice, laugh at silly things. Laura welcomed everything with a newly acquired delicacy, like someone dealing with something too precious to be let slip away again. One of those afternoons when Thomas spent a few hours in her apartment, Laura was cooking when he came into the kitchen with a drawing in his hands. It was a picture of the old house, with the family gathered in the backyard. Daniel holding the camera, Leo playing ball, she next to the barbecue, and Thomas with a dog they never had. The drawing was simple, but full of memory. She looked at it and asked what it meant. Thomas shrugged and said that sometimes he liked to remember how things were. Laura couldn't hold back her tears. Not because I was sad, but because there was something deeply human in that gesture. A son who, even when hurt, was still able to build with colors what life had undone with decisions. He didn't shy away from her tears. He sat next to her and said that if she continued the way she was, maybe one day Leo would be able to draw again too. Meanwhile, Daniel was dealing with the complexity of raising children in a scenario he never imagined he would live in. His conversations with Leo became more intense. The boy began to ask more difficult questions, about fidelity, trust, and what defines a family. Daniel found himself in internal dilemmas as he tried to answer. He didn't want to paint the boy's mother as a villain, but he also couldn't erase reality. In one of these conversations, sitting on the porch while Thomas slept on the couch, Leo asked if Daniel still loved Laura. The question was dry, blunt. Daniel took a while to answer. He said that love doesn't disappear like a switch that is turned off, but changes form. That he respected what they had experienced, but that today he was a different man, with different needs, a different understanding of life. Leo listened quietly. And then he said that sometimes he missed the way things were. Daniel replied that he did too. But that you can't live in the past forever. The answer didn't end the subject, but it built a bridge. Leo, for the first time, seemed less burdened. Isabel, on the other hand, remained firm, but not oblivious. She knew that she was carrying something very delicate in her hands, living with two children who still had a mother alive, present, even if far away. She never tried to be a substitute, but she was always ready. When Leo got sick and asked her to take him to the doctor, she went. When Thomas had an anxiety attack before a test, she knew how to welcome him. But always aware that her place was to support, never to possess. One day, Daniel found her sitting on the bed, looking at a photo of the boys when they were younger. She said that sometimes she was afraid of loving them too much. Daniel smiled, sat next to her and said that love was never the problem. The problem was always the absence of it. Laura was invited to give a talk at an NGO about emotional reconstruction. She thought about turning it down. She didn't think she was ready. But she went. She told her story without embellishments. She spoke of betrayal, loss, shame, but also of the journey back to herself. When she finished, a woman from the back of the room approached her and said that she was going through something similar. That she didn't want to make a mistake, but was already on the verge of doing so. Laura held her hand and simply said, "Don't wait until you lose to understand the value of what you have." That night changed her forever. For the first time in a long time, she felt that the pain she had experienced served something greater than herself. The following month, Leo had his birthday. It would be his first celebration with everyone together since the separation. Daniel and Isabel organized a little party in the park, with their school friends, a simple cake and restrained laughter. Laura was invited. She arrived punctually, with a discreet gift in her hands. Isabel greeted her naturally, Daniel with a respectful nod. Laura stood aside, observing. But she was not rejected. Friends of the boys greeted her politely. Thomas pulled her aside to see the balloons. Leo thanked her for the gift with a quick hug. She understood the gesture. She didn't need more. At the end of the party, when the guests had already left, Leo stayed by her side for a few minutes. He didn't say much. He just said he was happy everyone was there. And that was enough. One Sunday, Daniel was on the porch, organizing some photos for a new project, when Laura showed up, out of the blue. He wasn't expecting it, but he wasn't surprised either. She wanted to personally deliver two of the boys' old albums, which she found in a box while she was tidying up. She also brought a letter. She said it was for him, but that he didn't need to read it there. Daniel thanked her. The silence between them was more comfortable than before. Before leaving, she looked into his eyes and said that she never expected reconciliation, but that she hoped that one day she would no longer be a painful presence in his path. Daniel replied that time has curious ways of healing, but that he was still learning. She smiled and left. When he read the letter later, he found sincere, mature words. An apology that didn't demand forgiveness, only understanding. It was the end of a cycle. Life went on, without any major explosions. Only with small achievements. Leo started visiting Laura more often. Thomas started sleeping at her apartment from time to time. Laura attended school meetings, but stayed in the background, observing. She learned to be a part of things, even if from afar. Daniel stayed with Isabel, now with more concrete plans. They talked about marriage, but without rushing. They also talked about adopting a child in the future. Not as a replacement, but as an expansion of what they had already built. When they told the boys, Leo kept quiet, but did not object. Thomas was excited. When Laura found out, she did not cry. She just closed her eyes and wished that whoever this child was would find the home that she had once destroyed. Rebuilding a life after such a sudden fall is never linear. There are ups and downs, advances and setbacks, doubts that do not dissipate with time. But above all, there is the possibility of transformation. Not of the same story, but of a new one. And each of them, in their own way, understood this. The suffering did not define them, but shaped them. The guilt was not erased, but dealt with. And love, even in different forms, continued to exist. Laura could now smile again. Daniel, at last, found peace. The children, still growing, learned from the example, not of perfection, but of the humility to recognize mistakes and the power to continue, even with a patched heart. And in this process, everyone was, little by little, breathing again. The breeze that blew through the window on that spring afternoon seemed to carry the scent of a new beginning. Time had passed, and with it, the ghosts had lost their strength. The wound that had once bled with each memory was now just a deep mark, the kind that hurt when touched, but that were also proof of survival. Laura was sitting by the lake, alone, watching the water move slowly. She was holding a book in her hands, but she wasn't reading it. Her gaze was lost between the reflections of the sky and the thoughts that still crossed her mind like ancient echoes. She had finally learned not to nurture hopes where they no longer fit. Love, that had been home for so long, was now history. Not for lack of feeling, but for too many consequences. She was at peace with that. For the first time, she could say that without lying to herself. Her relationship with her children had taken on a new form. Thomas was her companion at Sunday lunches, talkative, sweet, full of stories and questions. Leo, with his introspection intact, spent quieter afternoons by her side, but his gaze was already full of tenderness. He never said he forgave her, but he also never spoke of resentment again. That, for Laura, was enough. One day, while they were walking together through a book fair, Leo stopped in front of a stall, picked up a plain cover copy, and said he thought she would like it. It was a novel about mistakes and redemptions. Laura bought it, holding the book as if she were receiving an inheritance. In the dedication, weeks later, she simply wrote, "Thank you for not giving up on seeing me." Daniel had consolidated his new life with Isabel. The ceremony was discreet, with a few friends and their children as witnesses. There was no party, but there was truth. The vows were short, but full of meaning. Isabel wore a light blue dress and a smile that said it all. Daniel, moved, mentioned in his speech that life does not always give us what we ask for, but sometimes it gives us what we need. After the wedding, they adopted an 8-year-old girl. Sophia was shy, soft-spoken, but with a look that sought shelter in every corner. The boys welcomed her with care, as if they understand what it is to lose and, therefore, learn to value. Daniel found in Sophia a second chance at fatherhood, a way to practice what he had learned from the mistakes of the past. Laura was invited to write an article about starting over for a digital magazine aimed at women. At first, she hesitated. But she accepted. She wrote from the heart. She recounted her experience, not with victimhood, but with courage. She exposed her flaws, her impulsive choices, the devastating impact that betrayal has on all layers of human existence. But she also spoke about rebuilding. The arduous path of looking within, the pain of being rejected by one's own children, the silent effort to regain space without forcing one's presence. The text went viral. She received messages from all over the world. People cried, forgave, asked for advice, and were simply grateful for having put into words what so many felt but were unable to express. Laura was not proud of what she had done, but she had found purpose in the sincere exposure of her pain. One cold night, Laura received a call from Daniel. They hadn't spoken in months. He told her that Sophia wanted to meet her. He said that the girl was curious about the boy's mother, and that, despite her initial reluctance, he thought it was important for her to also learn a little about the family's history. Laura couldn't contain her surprise. She asked if it was really a good idea. Daniel replied that, for the first time, he thought everyone was ready. The meeting was brief, in a park, with Isabel present. Sophia was a man of few words, but she smiled when Laura offered her a children's book as a gift. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was significant. Laura understood that this gesture sealed something she would never have imagined possible, a place of recognition, even if distant, in the life that was once hers. Thomas continued to grow, curious and affectionate. He chose to study psychology, saying he wanted to better understand people's feelings. He said he thought that if people understood each other better, they would make fewer mistakes. Laura cried when she heard this. Leo, with his firm gaze and critical thinking, decided to study literature. He wanted to write, tell stories, perhaps invent new endings for lives like the one he had lived. One day, he showed his mother a story. It was about a betrayed man who, despite being destroyed, chose to move on without resentment. Laura read it, holding back tears, knowing that the text was much more than fiction. Daniel and Laura never became friends again, but they developed a relationship of deep respect. When Thomas was accepted to a university far away, the two met to discuss the logistics of the move. The conversation was practical, but there was something beautiful about the way they managed to coordinate everything without friction. At the end, Daniel looked at Laura and said that, despite everything, she had done her part with dignity. Laura just nodded. She knew that this recognition was worth more than any reconciliation. Isabel, now officially a stepmother, was loved by her 3 children. She never tried to force intimacy, but she won the hearts of each of them with her constancy and care. One day, in a casual conversation with Leo, he called her part of the family. She did not cry there, but she kept that moment as one of the most precious of her life. Daniel knew he had found something rare. The woman who had been by his side in the most difficult moments was also the one who knew how to build, with ease, a new story. And now, seeing her teach Sophia to ride a bike in the same square where, years ago, he had cried in silence, he felt that life, despite everything, had been generous. Laura, on a rainy weekend, returned to the restaurant where everything had fallen apart. She sat at the same table where she had been confronted, now alone. She ordered a coffee and opened the notebook where she wrote reflections. Not for others, but for herself. She wrote about choices, consequences, and how loving requires courage, but also responsibility. She ended with a simple sentence: "The pain broke me, but awareness rebuilt me." She paid the bill and left, without looking back. This story is not about perfection. It is about what happens when love is hurt, when trust is destroyed, when selfish decisions break bonds that seemed unbreakable. It is about pain, but also about maturity. About losses that cannot be undone and forgiveness that does not erase, but teaches. It is about moving forward even when everything falls apart. And, above all, it is about the power we have to choose who we want to be after the chaos. If you've made it this far, tell us what you think of this story. We want to hear your opinion. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys homes, memories, futures. It erodes what was built with years of affection and turns love into absence. No passion is worth the price of the pain it leaves behind. And on this channel, we always reinforce, we do not support any type of betrayal. Here, we tell stories to show the real impact these choices have. Now take a deep breath. And think carefully, before crossing a line of no return.